Oh, it's time for another edition of MLB This Week. It's the MLB This Week show, and this week we're going to deviate a little bit from our sports podcast. Hello, everyone. My name is Rich,
And I'm Gary.
and we're going to teach you guys out there, hopefully anybody that wants to learn, how to start a sports podcast and how the easy way to start up a podcast. We've been doing this for a long time now, haven't we, Gary?
Yes, sir, Rich. And is there an easy way to do this?
Well, we've certainly graduated through the trials and errors of making our podcast, and we wanted to share some of our tips. We know a lot of people that send us emails and have an interest in podcasting. They want to know a little bit more about it. They might be curious on how to start a podcast. So this short tutorial from us will hopefully help you do that. And Gary, I guess the most important thing before you start a podcast is to come up with a good topic.
Yes, you got to have something that you're passionate about and really enjoy talking about, and have an idea or try to have an idea where you want to go and what you want to say for each episode. We do baseball podcasts, so really it's more of a recap show and any breaking news and that sort of thing, and interviews. So we kind of go by the fly by our pants, by the seat of our pants weekly, because it's really, we can't really lay out a thing long term. But there are so many subjects out there, so many topics, and even if you have a passion for basket weaving, you'd be surprised how many people are out there that would want to listen to a podcast about basket weaving.
Absolutely. And when I started podcast, it was about 8 years ago now. It's hard to believe I've been podcasting 8 long years. It was a broad topic on sports in Philadelphia. And every week we covered football, basketball, baseball, hockey, whatever sport was in season. Sometimes it ended up to be 3 or 4 sports that were in the season, and that got to be a little bit too broad. We couldn't do it all in 40 minutes, and we sort of, me and my co-host started out talking about one sport, and then it evolved into the next sport, into the next sport. We couldn't really focus our attention onto any one thing long enough because we had the rest of the sports to get through on the show each week. So we did about 40 shows or so, maybe even more, talking about the general sports scene in Philadelphia. And then one winter, I decided we better just narrow this down to baseball, and that seemed to be both of myself and my co-host biggest passion was baseball at the time, and it still is. But that's what I would suggest. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, narrow that topic down. Don't just take a broad subject like football, although you can, but your better way is to go after a small niche, and that might be like a certain team, say the Steelers or the Patriots, or in baseball you might want to pick the Cubs or the Marlins or a team like that.
Exactly, and then your next step would be, as you said, you got to be passionate about it, and content's got to be good. It's got to be intriguing. It's got to keep people wanting to come back because you've got good content. Your presentation is excellent, and that's really the whole key to this whole thing.
Yeah, and it's not going to come to you in the first 5 episodes or 10 episodes or even 20 episodes, but what you want to try to do is offer your audience the best content that you feel is possible, things that you want to know about. Chances are other people want to know about too, but you want to do your research on the subject, whatever it may be, and that is the key to getting listeners in podcasts. A lot of podcasters will say there's different ways and different methods with Twitter and social media and things like that, but believe it or not, it's just good old-fashioned content and the quality of content that's going to draw in a listener. Yeah, you may want to broadcast your show to the different social networks as well. That's a little bit down the line. You're just now starting to think about doing a podcast. And Gary, there's some interesting places on the internet, free as a matter of fact, that a lot of folks can start their own podcasts out. If they wanted to do one, for example, in 5 minutes, you could start a podcast.
Yes, it's true, and a lot of the expert podcasters that we listen to on many different shows will tell you that you shouldn't do this, but if you're not that experienced and don't want to get into all the minutia of RSS feeds and all of that, then use one of these hosting sites. They work fine. There's a couple that have been around a real long time now. A couple have failed, so you have to be know about that. So always keep another backup of your program. But the couple that are around now, Rich, they've been around a long time, and I don't see them going anywhere. And I'm talking like Podomatic.com is one, Podbean.com, which is what I actually started on. Spreaker now, SoundCloud. They seem very solid. They know what they're doing, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be a problem about those places folding up and leaving you in the lurch. Now, I also like to send my feed through FeedBurner. A lot of people hate that. They don't want to do it, all the professionals. I like it because I jump around sometimes from hosting services, and I don't know a darn thing about HTML and RSS, and it just, I start reading it about it, and my head wants to explode. So, it's easy just to put an address into FeedBurner and let them give you an address that you give to iTunes. And it's all handled that way. And if you want to change somewhere else, you just change the address in FeedBurner. But FeedBurners are owned by Google, and they keep thinking that Google's just going to shut it down one day, and then you'll be stuck. So, haven't found another alternative to FeedBurner. So you're on your own. That's the one thing I would try to say, though, is if you can get your RSS feed. And don't let like a Podbean or a Podomatic handle it directly. Set it up yourself the best. You'll be better off in the long run. But as you said, Rich, there's a ton of free possibilities. And look, we use Podomatic, and the only thing wrong with that is it's a free service, or you can pay. And when you pay, it's more storage and more bandwidth. But if you're starting out, start out with the free one. If you get a big audience, then you can consider moving up to a paid service. But starting out, I go with something like that, a free service, and just go with it. And again, it's really the content. And I know we're going to do another show on equipment, but you don't need a lot to start. You really don't. And it's really the content. Rich, you ever go back and listen to some of your first episodes?
I do often. Sometimes I'll run a current podcast and include some clips of previous shows that I've done from 6, 7, 8 years ago, and it's really interesting to hear what you were talking about back then. And of course, as time goes by so quickly, becomes like a relic over time. So yeah, you do you save all your old podcasts, as Gary told you, and that's very important because you have your catalog. If something should happen to a hosting service that you go with, say it's one of the free services, then you have a backup of your shows where you could theoretically pick it up and put it onto another service. So that's very important as well. Make a backup of all your shows. In the beginning, Gary, I used to put them on CDs. I
Hmm.
think I still have about 50 CDs laying around somewhere with the first 100 or 150 shows that I've done.
Yeah, and if you can make a couple of copies, because I had a bunch on a hard drive and an external hard drive, and that went bad. So I was able to reconstruct some from just the websites and stuff. But I'm like you. I started about 6.5, 7 years ago, and I did a golf show called Talking Golf with Gary, and did 245 episodes. And I
Amazing.
decided that it was too much between the. Had started in the interim doing Mets musings, and like you, I had a co-host, and then he left, so I was doing it solo. But it was just
Mhm.
becoming too much work between the golf and the baseball, and so I just decided to do Mets musings, and then you came along and asked me to do MLB with you, and I said yes, and then I started doing a
And now
Brooklyn
you have
Fight Club.
three.
But the difference is that when you're researching one, you can actually, do your prep and research for all three shows almost. Because if
Hmm.
I'm looking at Major League Baseball sites and everything, and if a story comes up with about the Mets, I can take that and include it in Mets musings and look for something else for MLB. So it's not really a lot of extra work in the preparation. I know we're going to get to that later, but that's but again, the whole content is the whole king to the whole idea of doing a podcast.
Yeah, and in the early days of podcasting, there weren't as many hosting sites that there is now. I used to have a service that I paid $5 a month for. I believe it's called HipMunk or something strange like that. But they offered basically what a lot of services offer today for free. And don't get me wrong, these services are offering you something for free, but it's truly not free because, as Gary said, with your RSS feeds, they're going to basically control your RSS feed. If you go with a service like Podomatic.com or Blog Talk Radio, that's another good service that a lot of beginner podcasters start out with because it offers you several things. It'll offer you a live portal to stream out towards the internet as well. That's another factor to consider. Do you want your podcast to go live and have live listeners? They can even call a certain number with Blog Talk Radio, and I believe TalkShoe.com offers it as well. And that's a service that 10 years ago didn't even exist. And if you had to pay for it, it would be super expensive to do. So nowadays, everything's getting so cheap for podcasting, and there's plenty of good places to start off.
And another thing to consider is whether you want to do audio or video, and that's a big decision nowadays. Some people want to do both. We happen to do a video and an audio on MLB. Um, some people don't want to do video at all, and it's an extra expense, and it does add time. But that's another thing to consider. Do you want to just do audio or video? So what is the pros and the cons of doing both? It's another
Exactly.
out to get your show. It's most people would put a show on YouTube, and it's pretty simple. And I have to tell you that the video now, the way you can do it, is pretty simple compared to when we started. Rich, because I've tried the UStream and some of the other ones. What the heck? I can't even think of them.
Justin TV.
Justin TV, yeah, and some of them are out of business now. And they were they made things very complicated, and the quality wasn't very good. And UStream, particularly, I used to use them for some live shows and video, But then it got into, somebody contacted me one time and said, well, I was watching your show, and right in the middle of it, there was a commercial. I said,
Mm-hmm.
really? And I went back and watched it, and that's what they started inserting commercials right in the middle of your show. And that's okay, but they don't stop the video. So you're talking about a subject, and they put on a 30-second commercial, but you're still talking 30 seconds, and nobody's hearing you. And then when it comes back, you may be on a totally different subject, and everybody's saying, oh, scratching their heads.
Right. Yeah.
So
That was one of the bad parts of that. Yeah.
right, and they didn't have a way of fixing that. If it's a recorded show on there, and boy, you'd run into problems getting them to recognize your camera or your program, and it was just a mess. So now it's a lot easier with these Google Hangouts. This actually, once we got most of the bugs worked out, it works pretty darn good. And it goes right to YouTube, and it's a pretty good resolution. The quality's good. So, if you start now, that's, like I said, the big key is to decide whether you want to do an audio or video or both, and then see what your options are from there.
Yeah, and as Gary said, to protect your RSS feed, you may want to consider starting off with a service called feedburner.com. Google did purchase them recently within the last couple of years. But basically what you're doing is saying, okay, my show is here at feedburner.com, but then you're feeding your show from any place that you want to, like podomatic.com or MixLR. A number of different services would feed the show to FeedBurner, and the FeedBurner will in turn feed your feed out to iTunes. So it's probably a little confusing, especially for a new beginner with podcasting, to understand RSS feeds. So we'll just touch on that just a little for this show. Maybe on future shows on podcasting we'll delve a little deeper into it. But basically you want to try to have that buffer between the free account that you're using and your iTunes and other services like Stitcher Radio that you might want to send your show out to, because after you start with a service like Blog Talk Radio, for example, they will send your feed right to iTunes if you want them to, but you may not want that, because if you want to drop Blog Talk Radio in 3 months after you've graduated from it, it's going to be difficult if you didn't have that middle provider like FeedBurner or even Libsyn or another hosting service called Blueberry, and that's on the WordPress blogs, Blueberry hosting. So there's a number of different ways to start podcasting. And Gary, let's just talk a little bit about equipment. What should a beginner podcaster try to get to use straight off the bat for their show?
Well, Rich, it's getting easier and easier. I mean, when we started, I don't know exactly how you started, but when I started, I had a headset and a laptop, and that was it. And I recorded into a program called Audacity, which was a free program, and that's basically it. And as you go on, I was the type, and I know you are, that I wanted to get a better sound. It wasn't sounding good enough to me. I wanted to improve it. So you start to research a little about microphones, and you join different sites and get recommendations about microphones. And before you know it, you can go crazy. I mean, there are people that have some big setups. But really, you can start with a laptop and a headset. Or, you know what? Nowadays, you can even start with your cell phone. Believe it or not, you can do a podcast with a cell phone. There's a program that I use called Boss Jock, which is, I use it on the iPad, and it's like the old radio cartridge programs for jingles and stuff like that. And you can set that whole thing up. but you can also record in there. So you can get a microphone that hooks into your iPad or your iPhone or your Android phone, and you can do a podcast right that way. It's getting so easy that again, it's you can put out a decent quality, but the content is still what drives everything.
Yes, it is. And even with your services, as Gary said, you can record the show onto a hard drive, a laptop, a PC, or even a phone, as Gary said, and then you can upload it to your service. That's probably going to give you your best quality. If you go right through a service called Blog Talk Radio or TalkShoe.com, they're going to compress the audio that they get from you from a file that might be a foot wide, say, to just an inch or two, because they have so many streams that they're serving. It would be prohibitively expensive to give everybody a great sound to them, so they're going to compress the sound so much that you're going to sound like you're talking on a phone, and a cheap phone at that. So if you've ever listened to the Blog Talk Radio podcasts, the majority of them don't sound very good, and that's because they're offering a free service and they're streaming it for you, and it's expensive to stream. Somebody's paying the bill for that. So you might want to record it locally from a microphone, and what I started out with was a Plantronics headphone set that I plugged right into a USB. I don't even think they had USB when I started. It was a 3.5 millimeter jacks, but now it's all USB. But they're going to sound your best to record your show. If you have a co-host, they could be joining you live, or you could record them over Skype. I've recorded a podcast for 8 years now with a co-host, and I don't think we've ever done a live show, both of us in the same room. But nobody would know that unless, they were told. Majority of the people probably feel that we're in the same room and in the same broadcast area. So a ton of ways to start your podcast. We've probably got some gears churning in some podcaster minds out there, Gary, but let's leave them all with a tip on what is our best tip on podcasting for this show that we're doing on introduction, starting off podcasting.
Find out what you're passionate about, or if you already know what you're passionate about, research it, see how many shows are out there, see if you can find a different angle than everybody. There's probably 1,000 tech shows out there, and yet people start tech shows every day, and you've got to find either an angle or just a different, as Rich said before earlier, a niche that you can get into and nobody else is doing, and you can have the usual news, but try to find something just a little bit different, and go with that. And again, content is king.
That's an excellent tip. And to close out this podcast, my biggest tip would be don't let no listeners dissuade you from doing your show, or a limited amount of listeners. Granted, if you're only getting 5 or 10 or 15, 20 listens per show, it's probably telling you, as Gary said, your content isn't what people want to hear, perhaps, or you're needing improvement in some areas. But don't let your failures, so to speak, squash your whole idea for podcasting, because it's sort of a hobby that evolves. You start off in one spot, and it's very rough and raw, and then you progress with it as time goes on, and you become better. You attract more listeners, probably on a longer basis that way, and you don't give up. That's probably my biggest tip. Don't give up if you have some failures early.
That's a great one, Rich.
Well, we hope everybody enjoyed this introduction to podcasting. All you budding podcasters out there, if you have any questions for us, go to our website. It's MLBThisWeek.com. You You can send us an email right from there. And Gary, we'll be glad to answer some of those questions on our next show on podcasting. It's been pretty fun, Gary.
I've enjoyed it, Rich.
Well, thanks again, and we'll talk to you real soon on MLB This Week. We'll be picking up with our shows talking about baseball and the off-season, the general managers meetings coming up in just a few days, and we'll have a whole lot to talk about. So we'll talk to you all soon on MLB This Week, the podcast.